This podcast is sponsored by Release Winery. Join us as the story of this ultra-limited wine continues. Learn more at releasewinery.com.
First vintage was 2010, so what does that make it?
Your 11th anniversary.
Yeah. Oh, I can attest to that. Being involved with a couple of startups in Napa, it's actually surprisingly few names that are still available out there. So when we came up with this name, Release Winery, I was surprised that we were able to get it. And when I say we, I'm talking about my old business partners, Eric and Mandy Ackerman. And what we did back in the days was, we started up the brand. 2010 was the first vintage, and then I took over the brand entirely as of 2016, and have been the sole proprietor and winemaker since then. So again, it kind of ties into my fascination for older or aged wines from Napa. And back in the 60s, the 70s. I think there was a tendency for the wines to be in a different style, lower alcohol for sure, but also a little bit more restrained on the fruitiness, and so looking at examples from especially hillsides around Napa, whether it's Mount Vida, where Mayacamas is coming from, or it could be Diamond Creek up on Diamond Mountain. I was fascinated by mountain regions. So when I got access to one vineyard up on Atlas Peak and tasted some wines coming out of that vineyard, I was immediately blown away. So that has been my go-to source, and ever since. So back in 2006 was probably the first time where I really started working with fruit from Atlas Peak, and it's been a favorite ever since. So I'd like to say that my benefit is probably that I've been involved very intimately with projects on Atlas Peak. So overviewing the vineyard, the viticulture on those properties gives me an advantage that I don't think any other winemaker will have. So I don't go out there and buy or purchase tonnage that I don't know about. I want to be involved in as much as possible in the growing of it, and then of course needless to say that your best friend is a vineyard manager. So once you have all the key players on the same side, then it's a great benefit for a winemaker to know the side intimately. So that was actually funny that you bring it up. That was a little bit of a cult project that I started back in 2010. We had this bleed juice that we didn't really want to add to the Cabernet Sauvignon. So I took it apart, fermented it separately, and what ended up being a little brick in this beginning was actually, it's a multi-vintage rosé. I don't think there's anybody else from Napa that has tried this, but so I kept it in a stainless steel drum, sealed up, and blended 7 vintages together. So everything from 2010 up through 2016 vintage, and then I bottled the first batch of it in 2017. And I have another small batch to be bottled at some point in the future. So my goal was to kind of, in the style of Solera, which is employed in Madeira, to bring all the vintages together, because with a rosé, I didn't want the vintage to shine through, so that should be a very consistent wine, versus the Cabernet that I'm making on the side. That I want really where the vintage should shine through. So it was a fun project. I wasn't aware that it would be such a success. I still have a few cases hidden away of that first batch from 2017, and I'm eager to get the new batch going as well. But it is definitely under the radar, and I made 120 bottles, not cases, 120 bottles available. So super scarce, and a pretty unique wine, if I have to say it myself. Without getting too technical, there's different directions in winemaking. There can be an oxidative style, or there can be a reductive style of winemaking. And specifically with the rosé, I wanted something that was mimicking an age-worthy rosé. And I know that those are not normally terms that you put in the same sentence, because rosés are made for early enjoyment. But I wanted to really stand out from the rest. So mine is actually a rosé that you should pour and decant. I come up with a recommendation of letting it sit in an open decanter for at least 3 days, and by then you get a wine that is ever so slowly starting to open up. I would like to say that I'm probably most likely going to stick with Cabernet Sauvignon for release, because in my other projects that I'm involved in, I get exposure to Chardonnay, to Sauvignon Blanc. I'm even making a small batch of a field blend from a unique little vineyard up in St. Helena in the northern part of Napa, which is planted to Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, Alicante Bouschet, so a lot of different varietals. So for release, I would like to just keep it somewhat simple, and then focus on getting it right, and of course putting that extra energy into letting the vintage shine and the style of release shine, because that is something where release is a wine that is per definition is made in the old school tradition of Napa. So I was fascinated with tasting wines, specifically Cabernet Sauvignon, coming out of Napa from the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, all low alcohol wines, but just with a ton of structure. So that was my inspiration for release, and hence the source that I have. It's one single vineyard high up on Atlas Peak, and it's one clone of Cabernet Sauvignon, very unique clone called the Weimar clone that I'm using. So it has to be something that really stands out and is something that is different from my daily day job, so to say. Yes, this past vintage was actually my 22nd here in Napa, and I hate generalizations. So when people are talking about a vintage, whether it's 2017 or 2020, where fires were apparent in Napa, I think the biggest mistake we can do is to generally just say, well, this is affected by X or X affected by Y. So in 2020, there no doubt will be many great wines coming out of Napa, and I think people that know winemakers from Napa and that know sites, they are of course aware that no winemaker will go out there and bottle something that is not up to par, and sure. Plenty of good examples from my own experience with 2020 vintage. Several areas that was not affected at all, and then of course some that really got the burden of the fires. And also it's important to state that there was 2 different fires in 2020. Right. So the early ones back in August affected some areas, and then of course the glass fire that hit late September affected primarily the northern part of Napa. So always there's always room for exceptions, and I have tasted stunning wines coming out of 20 vintage from Napa. So don't despair. So website is releasewinery.com. The best way to get in touch with me is probably through my personal email. I like to keep this brand as small and non-visible as possible. So I have a website. The buying feature has been disabled because otherwise I would be selling out way too fast. So best way to hear more about the project is to contact me on Henrik, and that's spelled Henrik @ releasewinery.com.